It's my honor to introduce our first speaker today, Professor Barbara Larson. Professor Larson is currently Executive Professor of Management at the DeMoore McKim School for Business. She has 12 years of teaching and research experience at Northeastern, and Professor Larson also has a degree in management from the Harvard Business School and an MBA in Finance and Operations Management from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. She has worked at R. Donnelley as the Director of International Finance and has 15 years of experience in finance and operations management roles. We're excited for her to share her thoughts about women in the workplace using her background in personal and interpersonal skills. So without further ado, please let us welcome on stage our first guest speaker, Professor Barbara Larson.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. First of all, thank you very much to Katie and to Anya and all of the other members of the committee. I know how hard it is to put these things together, and especially to do it for the first time. So you guys have something to really be proud of. So thank you for doing this for us and for Northeastern. Okay, well, so first of all, I do have some remarks to make. I have some thoughts. But first of all, today for you is going to be about asking questions, figuring some things out, and more than anything else, meeting other people. So I want to get you a little head start on that. So the first thing I want you to do, just for the next couple of minutes, is find somebody near you who you do not know already. Find somebody near you who you do not know, and just take a minute to introduce yourself to that person, okay? Just one-on-one. This isn't, I'm not making you come up here and do it, right? Just one-on-one. Introduce yourselves and tell each other why you came here today, okay? Why you came here today. So, 2 minutes. Okay, wow, all right. Good start at the networking. All right, Juliet, you're going to be teed up and ready to go here. They're warmed up. Okay, fabulous. So this is a little tricky because I tend to be a wanderer, but I have notes and I have a hand mic in it. So sorry in advance for any audio. And I have a loud voice too, so at some point I may give up on the mic and drive the live feed people crazy. But anyway, so listen, when the organizers of this conference asked me to come and open today with a talk on women in the workplace, I was a little bit stymied at first, to be honest. Okay, so I have been a woman in the workplace now for nearly 30 years. All right, that just freaks me out. But anyway, I've been a woman in the workplace for nearly 30 years, but I come to this now, at least as an academic, and I'm not a gender studies type of academic. That's not what I do for my research. I don't study gender in the workplace. I don't study work-family balance. I have some very talented colleagues who do, but that's not who I am. So my only expertise in this really comes from my own experience, all right, and a little bit of applied psychology, which we'll get into later on. So I went to the organizers for some guidance, and Katie Wong said to me, well, talk about why we're having this conference, right? Why we're having this conversation. Well, this one was a tough one for me too, because on one hand, being a woman in the workplace has gotten so much better in the last 30 years. It has gotten so much more dynamic. It has become much more enjoyable, much more rewarding. And so that's great, right? But the fact is that if it were done, right, if there weren't any gender-related issues left, we probably wouldn't be having this conference and this conversation. And despite all of the strides that women have made in the workplace, there are still huge, huge social and institutional barriers, and sometimes just downright difficult and even painful personal decisions and trade-offs that women have to make. Now, let me mention that men also increasingly are finding that they have to make these trade-offs and decisions. So it's not just women, but it is still much more women than men. So this is where I confronted my biggest problem. I didn't want to start the day off on a downer, right? I've already seen your faces kind of going, a little bit, right? And I didn't want to start the day on a low note with doom and gloom, right? And that sometimes can happen when you spend too much time with statistics. Trust me, as an academic, I know this, right? You spend too much time with statistics and, So I went back to Speech Writing 101, and I decided, okay, I'm going to deal with this by finding a joke to start the conversation today, right? All right, so I went looking for a joke. So what do you do when you're looking for something these days? Where do you go? Google, thank you, right? So I went to Google like any good researcher would, and I Googled women in the workplace humor, right? Okay, apparently you guys are more schooled in this than I am. I thought this was going to be easy, right? So the first search result I got said, women and humor, just what are we so scared of? Okay, this is not what I was going for, right? The second result was a little bit better. At first, at least, it said, make them laugh. Women, men, and humor in the office. Okay? So I felt better about this one until I read the first line of the article, which said, the first sentence, women aren't supposed to be funny, but men are. What? Okay, so this, by the way, I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here. This led me to some interesting research that I hadn't seen before, published by Judith Baxter at Aston University in the UK. This was published back in 2012. Baxter studied the use of humor in senior management meetings in the UK, and she found that more than 80% of women's jokes were met in these meetings with silence. Just like that, right? Meanwhile, about 90% of jokes made with men were greeted with immediate laughter or approval. So, as you can imagine, right, if you expect that, as a result, men were more than 3 times more likely to use humor when they were leading meetings than women. Interestingly, women were more likely to engage in what's called self-deprecating humor, right, where it's sort of humor at the expense of yourself, than men were. And men were more likely to use assertive or sometimes even slightly aggressive, what's called display-type humor, which is kind of humor to impress, right? Humor to either establish their leadership of the group or even to impress superiors in the group. Okay. But interestingly, when women used that type of humor, and frankly, even when they used the self-deprecating type of humor, they were more likely to be viewed as either insecure or abrasive, or both. Okay, so to me this raises a chicken and egg kind of question, right? Is it that women are actually not funny? Or is it that there's this pre-existing perception of women as not being funny that then results in the silence, right? Those of you, a couple of you in here, my former students, we've talked about stereotypes, right? And sort of pre-existing perceptions and self-fulfilling prophecies. Okay, so that may result in the silence as well. Okay, well, this is interesting, but this isn't particularly encouraging, right? And it's still not funny at all. Okay, so I went back to my Google search, right? Yeah, we're getting this, the levity is going down here, right? The next result, the third result on my list, was a cartoon stock site, right? So one of these where you go on and buy a cartoon. Well, they had a paywall, but before I hit their paywall, I found 10 cartoons out of the total of 13 that they said they had on their site related to women in the workplace, okay? So these cartoons, with the exception of one, which was about the glass ceiling, with the exception of one, these 10 cartoons were so unbelievably inappropriate and out of date that I kept looking. I was like, they must have the date on them somewhere. I kept looking at them. Was this written in 1965, right? Like, I just couldn't believe that this was on a website in the 21st century. The one that was not completely inappropriate, which was about the glass ceiling, was actually written from the point of view of men above the glass ceiling. It was a man sitting at a big CEO desk with all these women underneath the desk, and he's going, "That's funny, I didn't realize it was a glass ceiling. I always thought it was a glass floor." Okay, I didn't find that funny either, actually, but okay. Interestingly, all 10 of these cartoons, which were 10 of the 13 about women in the workplace on this cartoon website, were drawn by men. right? Okay, all of them. At this point, okay, so I gotta tell you, at this point I was so depressed that I almost didn't go on. But I noticed that the very next listing in my Google search results was a joke website. And in the title, it said there was a joke by Carol Leifer. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of Carol Leifer. Has anybody heard of her? Okay, she is okay, one person has. She is a show business writer, and she's perhaps best known for her tenure at the Seinfeld show, which I know predates many of you in this audience, but not all of us, right? Okay. And she was actually one of their key writers at the height of their success, and she's got a number of Emmy nominations for her work on Seinfeld, as well as some of her other work. She's written for the Oscars. More recently, she's written for the show Modern Family, right? She's a very, very successful comedic writer, and she does her own stand-up comedy as well. Okay, so I was encouraged by this. Interestingly, though, the joke is probably my least favorite of hers that I've ever read. It's not actually, in my opinion, that funny, but it's the only one that I could find on women in the workplace. Here's the joke. And by the way, this is not particularly a good joke, and it requires comedic timing that I definitely do not have. So here we go. Quote, "Ladies, women in the workplace. Oh, we still have big strides to make. You ready for this? A girlfriend of mine just got a new job. First question the new boss asked her was if she could make a good cup of coffee. Yeah, she stormed right out of that Starbucks." All right. At least I got some laughs. It's I thought it was kind of meh, but whatever. Actually, she's a lot funnier than I make her sound, and even that joke is probably a lot funnier than I make it sound. But here's where things get interesting. Here's what happened next. Okay, so at this point, as you can imagine, I was in deep despair, right? I had to give this talk. I couldn't find anything funny. I had managed to depress myself. And so I did what all good academics do. When I start to despair about something that I have to write, I quickly descend into the Google rabbit hole, right? Okay? So among many other things that I was Googling and reading, right, just to pass the time and watch the deadline grow increasingly shorter, I decided to Google Carol Leifer, right? What has she been up to lately? Okay? This is where it got interesting. I found, published in Vanity Fair a couple of years ago, an excerpt of her memoir that she wrote, published in 2014. The memoir is entitled, "How to Succeed in Business Without Really Crying: Lessons from a Life in Comedy." In it, Leifer recalls the inspiration for some of her funniest Seinfeld episode ideas. One of my favorite is, George brings a deaf woman to a party so she can lip read his ex-girlfriend's lips to find out why she broke up with him, right? Okay. But interestingly, she also notes that she quickly learned on Seinfeld to mine her own life, especially her life as a female, for ideas that would set her work apart from her largely male co-writers. She recalls pitching one idea for an episode in which Elaine, who some of you who are so young probably don't know who Elaine is, but Elaine was sort of the female, protagonist, I guess. Elaine thinks that the mirrors at Barney's are skinny mirrors. Okay, we all know what skinny mirrors are, right? Okay. Leifer says, "I knew this was a unique pitch for sure when I had to explain to the guys on staff what skinny mirrors are." Well, she recalls some other episodes as well, including another episode that I cannot repeat here, other than to say, for those of you who are Seinfeld fans, that it involves a frustrated saxophonist, but I'll leave that one out for now. In a Reddit AMA, right, Ask Me Anything session, later that year, in 2014, Leifer also noted, "You need to take what makes you different and use it to your advantage." So now I was starting to feel a bit better. Okay? Not only had I found, thankfully, some incontrovertible proof that women are funny, right, or at least can be funny, I also realized that there's something more important for me to talk to you about than the sometimes daunting statistics that we find related to women at work. But before I go there, let me have another word or two about statistics, right? I am sort of the token academic for today, and I am a researcher. Okay, not all of my work is quantitative. In fact, a lot of it isn't, but I appreciate a good regression analysis as much as the next academic, all right? I'll just tell you that. And yes, it does bother me that study after study after study still in 2016 continue to demonstrate that women command lower wages than men for the same work in a wide range of professions. Okay? And yes, it is frustrating to me that a study done just last year in 2015 by McKinsey and Company and by leanin.org, Sheryl Sandberg's organization, it examined the employee pipeline of 118 US corporations and found that in 2015, that while women occupied 45% of middle management roles, okay, so almost equal representation, they made up only about 1/6, that is 16 or 17% of the C-suite, which are the top management roles in these companies. And that similar statistic, 16 or 17%, applies to C-suite leadership and board of directors membership in Fortune 500 companies today. Okay? And of course, if you get up to the CEO level, that number goes down into the low single digits, right? It's about 4%, I think, for women CEOs in the Fortune 500. Okay, but here's the thing with statistics. Okay, and I want you to listen to this well. Here's the thing with statistics. They're not you. They are not you, okay? Not only, no, they don't define you, they don't define what you're capable of doing, nor do they define your future or your trajectory, okay? Statistics and studies can only report the past, and at best, they represent the almost present, at very best, okay? They do not represent the future. Now, absolutely, studying statistical trends can give you one possible outcome for the future, but let me tell you, a lot of you in here, I'm imagining, are finance majors, from the business school at least, right? And any investor in the stock market can tell you that predicting the future based on the past is dangerous and often a losing game, right? Now, in my field of study, psychology, right, I basically do applied psychology in the business school. We do know that gender biases, like racial and other biases, are often rooted in very deeply seated, often unconscious beliefs, as well as some deeply seated human tendencies, such as something called homophily, which is the tendency of individuals to associate and bond with similar others, okay? So this helps to explain why these biases have been so slow to change over the generations, and frankly the centuries, despite the efforts of many. But it also suggests, unfortunately, that they are going to be difficult to eradicate altogether. On the flip side, okay, so that's the downside. On the flip side, the power base held by women in the workforce is growing. Too slowly for sure, but it is growing and growing steadily. And as that power base grows, so do the opportunities for women and the options for women seeking to develop both a career and a rewarding personal life. So a lot has happened in the past 30 years, and I do expect these shifts to continue for the next 30 years. But while these shifts are occurring, where does this leave us? Where does this leave you? Well, listen, I don't know Carol Leifer, all right, as much as I like to talk about her. I don't know her. But I believe that in some way this is the approach that she took to her career. She ignored the statistics. She got in the game, and then she looked for opportunity. In particular, she found opportunities to distinguish and differentiate herself and her work, and in part by leveraging the unique perspective that she brought to this male-dominated field as a woman. And to be honest, this perspective is much truer, much more resonant to me and my own experience in 30 years of being a woman in the workplace. Do I have war stories about being the only woman and sometimes the first woman ever in professional situations, especially earlier in my career? Absolutely. Yes, I do. Could I tell you about being asked about my plans for marriage and children during a job interview at one of the world's largest oil companies? Or being told that I would never be able to work in the field at one of the world's largest industrial machinery manufacturers? Okay, note that both of these occurred as I was preparing to graduate with my MBA in finance and operations from the Wharton School. And by the way, I did not end up at either of these companies, so don't go back and look at my resume to try and figure out who they are, because they're not on there. Absolutely, I do have these stories, and I'd be happy to share them with you over a drink someday, right? But here's the thing, for every one of those stories, I have several, a good handful of other stories. Stories about leaders, both men and women, who mentored me, taught me, inspired me, and encouraged me. And whenever I'm asked to point to the factors underlying my career progression, which now, as a professor, I get asked this a lot, right, in the business school by my students, I point first, at least I hope I do, I think I usually point first to these men and women to whom I owe a great debt, a great debt. But second, I point to the work that I did to locate those men and women, right? To identify those men and women, to identify those jobs working for people who would be supportive, basically to identify those opportunities, okay? Now, this is what I wish for you, both for today at this wonderful conference and in the span of your professional career, okay? That your watchword be opportunity, not challenge, opportunity. You still can and you should continue to be aware of and do everything you can to counteract gender bias and gender-related challenges in the workplace, okay? These are not going to go anywhere, and there are things that you can do to make them better. But meanwhile, you need to stay laser-focused on discovering and creating opportunities to differentiate yourself. And this won't always be true, but if being a woman lends you to points of differentiation, so much the better. So much the better. And this is what today's conference is really about, finding opportunities and differentiating and distinguishing yourself in your own professional field. Your next speaker, Juliet Mayer, is going to address one of the best ways to find new opportunities through effective and authentic networking. Later on, you'll learn from Lauren States ways to identify and leverage leadership opportunities throughout your career. And the breakout sessions this afternoon are all about establishing your brand, right? And that is exactly finding these points of differentiation. Okay, so I will leave you with that, right? We are here at a women's conference, at a women's leadership conference, because there are challenges to being a woman in today's professional world. But more than that, there are tremendous opportunities. And that's what I wish for you today. Okay, so let me do a quick time check. Where's my time person? Julie, how am I doing? I'm good? Okay, so here's one last thing, since I do still have time. Here's one last thing that we're going to do. Okay, I know that all of you have smartphones with you, right? Is there anybody in this room who does not have a smartphone? I heard somebody's alarm going off earlier, all right? I know they're out there. Get those smartphones out, all right? Get them out. Hopefully you'll be able to get on the internet. If not, hopefully you can get a phone signal. Get out those smartphones. All right? Got them? Yeah? Let me see. Oh, thank you very much. All right? Okay. Now, wave them in the air. No, this is not a concert. No, we're not going to do that. All right. What I want you to do is send yourself an email, all right? Or a text. If you can't get the internet, fine, then send yourself a text, okay? I want you to send yourself a text with at least, or an email, with at least one objective that you have for yourself today. Okay, one specific objective, either something you want to learn, right? A question that you would like to have answered in the course of the day today, someone you would like to meet in particular by name, or in more generically, a type of connection that you would like to make, okay? More than one is great, but at least one specific objective, okay? I'm gonna give you about a minute to do that. Send yourself a text or an email. Pretty soon I wanna start hearing whoosh. Actually, no, you were probably all on silent, but that's what I want you to do, okay? Great, okay. So now, if you haven't done so already, send yourself this email, hit send, or this text, and commit to being able to, at least in theory, right? You don't have to actually do this, but at least theoretically, to be able to answer this email by the end of the day, by the end of the afternoon, with the words, I did it. Okay? All right, and that's what I wish for you. Please enjoy the rest of the conference and your time here on campus today. Thank you very much for having me. This is one of my former students, by the way. I did not seed her, but this is one of my great former students.
Thank you. So you talked about the power base growing, and it's slowly growing.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I'm always concerned with how can we increase the pace so that by the time my daughter is older than I am now, she's not finally reaching equity pay in the
Right.
workforce,
Right.
or equity in representation in the workforce.
Okay, thank you. So the question is, just for purposes of the mic, the question is, how can we accelerate the rate of growth in the power base so that when Stephanie's young daughter is Stephanie's age or slightly older, that she's not dealing with the same inequity issues that we are. I wish I had an easy answer to that, right? I wish I had even a decent answer to that. I think that most social change, okay, and before I did applied psychology, and earlier in my doctorate, I did more sociology and social change in particular. And if you look at social change in general, most social change tends to happen on a curve that's sort of like this, okay? If you look at gay marriage, for instance, right, in the past, if you look at it in the past 5 years, it looks like it's been exploding. If you look at it in the past 30 years, it looks more like this, and then kind of an exponential peak in the last few years. And that's what we tend to find with social change, and change in general, is that it tends to have these pops up and then periods of relative latency, right, relative sort of almost just the equilibrium, okay? Though it doesn't feel like equilibrium for those of us who are not, benefiting from it. And so I think that is what that's what I think has happened in the past and what will continue to happen. And so I think that we are in a period now, and this is just my opinion, this is not a professional, I think we're actually in a period now of relative stasis, to be honest. There are changes going on. But if you look at, say, 20 years or 25 years ago, there was huge amounts of change happening. And it started to level off a little bit. And I think that during those periods of stasis, as I tell my students when we study punctuated equilibrium in organizational behavior, does anybody remember that from OB? Stephanie, do you remember that? Okay, thank you. So when we study punctuated equilibrium, we know that when you're in those periods of relative stasis, you don't despair, right? Even though sometimes it feels tempting, you continue the groundwork, right? You keep working and you keep working because you know that there's going to hit a point where there's going to be a tipping point where something is going to happen that is going to push the trend into one of these spikes. And that honestly, to me, is, and from a 30-year perspective of this, is that I have had a 30-year perspective of mostly being in the system and working within the system to enact change, both in modeling behavior, but in encouraging behavior, but in relatively small ways. And I think that there are, luckily, some people who take much bigger leadership roles, and they tend to get a lot of press, and that's great. And thank heaven there are those people. And I'm imagining that some of you are going to be those people if you aren't already. But that's not all of us. And that's okay. And in fact, one of the things that I didn't talk about today that I was thinking of talking about is that in the issue of women in the workplace, there is not, you're not either winning or losing, right? You're not successful or unsuccessful, okay? You are you. And you do what makes sense for you. And the best thing that we can do for any social change, including this, is to have a groundswell of consistent modeling of behavior and action, and then be ready to trade on and leverage those points of inflection where there is rapid progress. So it's not a sexy answer, but it's the best I got. Sorry. What else? Anything else? Any other questions? Yes?
How do you get more men involved in what largely seems to be a women's issue?
Okay, that's okay. I can repeat it. How do you get men more involved in what largely seems to be a women's issue? Okay, so this is a tough one. I think it depends in part on what you mean by involved. Okay, right. So this is where I'm going with this. Okay, I actually think there are a tremendous number of men that are involved in this effort to increase women's equity, but you don't see them at these, you don't see them in public fora often. I think there's a variety of reasons for that, honestly. This is a nuanced issue. I don't think it's like, oh, well, they don't want to be seen as supporting women, right? I don't think that that's the case. I mean, I think probably sometimes the case, but it's not always the case. I think sometimes they get a little bit daunted, like, well, it's like just like showing up in a bar where they're all, big guys in leather jackets, and you're the only woman. It's kind of the same feeling for a man coming to one of these conferences, right? They're in a distinct minority. I think that it's again, I don't bring an absolutist point of view to this issue, and I think those can be helpful at certain points in time, but I think in the grand span of time and of progress, those aren't helpful. I actually have an enormous number of men in my career who have been incredibly supportive, helpful, advocated for women. One of my biggest advocates at one of my, the job at FMC Corporation, where I spent most of my finance career, was a man who I initially had a very, very bad kind of gender-related interaction with when we first met. And he was in a position of power and I was not. And I will say, for those of you who've had OB, I made some internal attributions about his character right away. And we got off to a very bad start, right? And in fact, then in the span of a year, he became an enormous advocate for me. And I think, and that was always in him. It was just not obvious. So I think that you have to look, we need to look at these things on a macro level, and we do need men in leadership positions to be standing up. I do think, this is where Lean In, I think, is brilliant, because they have recruited men, men in sports, right? And they're working on men in leadership positions as well, to stand up and to be, strong, involved role, father figures, right? And to support their spouses in their careers. And I do think that that's important. But I also think that often that can feel daunting to those of us who don't occupy those positions already. And for those of us who don't, there's still lots that we can do to leverage the existing support that there is out there in men. And I think, in a sense, that for me is more important almost. Yes.
The point person for She Leads, which is a program that Career Development has run for 3 years now, and some of our programming is about communication, negotiation, and confidence skills for women. So give us a look. But I just wanted to add to your response, because I have a perspective of, even though I look 35, about 40 years, and thank you. And I was, in the 80s, I worked in the corporate headquarters of a semiconductor company in the area, and I worked with all the men in the C-suite as a corporate communications person, and they would not swear in front of me, or if they accidentally did, they'd apologize, because they saw me as equivalent to their daughters. Now I know many, many, many men who say, I don't want my daughter to face that. That is a huge difference. So I want to say that even though I'm still in the trenches in a way, and I understand what the challenges are that we have, it has changed so much. Help another woman, talk to your dad, talk to your brothers, and just a recent example, the women's national soccer team just has been filing, I think it's a legal action against the federation for unequal pay, and some of the men have stepped up to support them. So I think we're in a hopeful place.
I would agree. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, I think we're just about there. Yeah, we're good. All right, you guys ready? Yes? Okay. I'm not going to introduce the next speaker. There's somebody else on deck to do that, but she is awesome. So enjoy the day, and I'll see you around campus. Thanks a lot.